On a normal night in November, Officer Gerald Dixon was on routine patrol in his district, checking the businesses in the area. After noticing two young men acting suspicious, first in the parking lot of a bowling alley, then shortly afterwards in the parking lot of a grocery store, he decided to stop and talk to them and to see what was going on. Little did Officer Dixon know that the next 2 minutes of his life would include a life or death struggle. It was November 15th, 1990, and Officer Dixon was about to be the first Edmond police officer ever involved in a lethal force incident that resulted in a fatality.
You have the training, but nothing can teach you to deal with that mental aspect of having to possibly shoot someone or take their life.
10 years later, in the summer of 2001, another Edmond police officer would find himself in a life-threatening situation where the safety of fellow officers and an entire community was in danger. Officer Jason Stearns was one of the first police officers to respond to the calls of a man walking around in a neighborhood shooting a high-powered rifle.
And I remember thinking, he's coming right at us. We're in the same spot he is, just directly north. He's running north at us. Then we heard some gunshots.
It's not like any other job in America. It's been described by some as moments of tedium followed by mere seconds of sheer terror. And a police officer never knows when those events of terror are going to take place. The worst thing that could happen to a police officer is that he or she becomes lax and thinks that everything is routine, because there is no such thing as a routine stop. Each event that an officer is involved with, the officer has to approach that event as what are the potential threats that exist, because we have seen multiple events that turn from a routine stop and all of a sudden you're now facing a life or death situation. We unfortunately have one of the most violent occupations that anyone can undergo. In fact, in recent times, we're seeing an unprecedented number of officer killings. Just in the last couple of months, we've had multiple officer shootings and killings of officers throughout the country. When people have a grudge against either their government or even their employer or sometimes even a family member, they oftentimes take it out on a police officer because he's that first line of defense. We know we're in a dangerous business. We're trained to deal with those circumstances, but we have to have the tools available to answer to any potential threat that may present itself to our officers. And that will sometimes require the use of deadly force.
After observing some suspicious activity by two males late one night, Officer Gerald Dixon approached them in the parking lot of a grocery store.
The one on my right had very nervous body language. He kept putting his hands in his pocket, kept shuffling his feet, and I asked him several times to keep his hands out of his pocket. And every time I'd ask him, he would take his hands out for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, and then he'd go back to putting his hands in his pocket.
As a precaution, Officer Dixon conducted a search on the nervous individual. As he patted down the suspect, he felt something in the man's waistband.
It felt like the grip of a gun, and immediately when I touched it, the fight was on.
As they struggled over the firearm, it discharged, shooting the suspect in the leg. Still, the man was able to fight Officer Dixon. The other suspect at the scene fled on foot, leaving behind his partner and Officer Dixon.
Headquarters, any unit can start for 33rd and Boulevard. Just received a call advising gunshots.
When you're involved in dangerous or possible deadly situations, you have to be concerned not only for your safety, but as well as the citizens that are around you.
An employee from inside the nearby store approached the officer, asking if they could help.
I told them no, go back in the store and to call the police department, tell them our officer needs assistance in the midst of this fight. We continued to fight, and during that fight, a lot of people say, what do you think about when you're in that? I had a peace that came over me. It's like God spoke to me and says, everything's going to be all right. And I had that inner peace in that storm, because that's what it was to me. It was a storm.
He knew that if he does not act properly, if he does not respond to the threat that has been given to him, he is probably going to be executed by the gentleman that he confronted. He was well trained. He was well conditioned. As a result, he was able to not only just to hold on, but was able to overcome an adversary that was intent on killing him.
And at one time he had his gun pointed at the center of my head. And the thing that kept him from being able to pull the trigger again was the holes that I had learned through defensive tactics.
The two men also struggled over possession of Officer Dixon's own firearm. During the altercation, the gun discharged and a bullet entered Officer Dixon's lower left leg. Now both wounded, the men continued to fight for control of the weapon. By applying the training that he had received as a police officer, Dixon was able to gain control of his firearm and shoot the suspect, ending the fight. Wounded and bleeding, the police officer hopped over to his patrol car, where he was able to rest on the hood and call for help.
That quarter's been shot! That quarter's been shot!
It had all happened in a matter of seconds.
I called out on the radio at 12:02 to it said I was checking these guys. And at 12:04 is when I called back out on the radio telling headquarters that I've been shot.
Officers and paramedics arrived onto the scene. Officer Dixon was taken to the hospital. The downed suspect subsequently died due to the injuries sustained from the bullet wound. The other suspect involved later returned to the parking lot and was arrested.
This is not something that Gerald ever wanted to do, but he was trained that if these circumstances presented themselves, he had no alternative but to defend himself and take the necessary action to neutralize that threat that was presented to him. Lethal force is one that we are most times reluctant to use, and it's seldomly used, but it's one that we know sometimes is absolutely mandatory. We are trained very closely to follow Supreme Court precedent, which says that force can only be used when it's reasonable. So we train our officers to very closely follow the reasonableness standard, that if under the circumstances, if they feel their life or the life of another is in jeopardy and it's reasonable to use force, they will use force if necessary.
In the early evening on June 22, 2001, Officer Jason Stearns was working a vehicle accident when the call came over the radio that a man was wandering in an Edmond neighborhood with a high-powered rifle.
We had just gotten patrol rifles. It was just the very beginning of our patrol rifle program, and there were only a few on the street. I don't know how many there were that night, maybe only one or two, and I happened to have one, so I decided it was probably a good idea to start heading that way.
Edmond 911. Yes, there's a guy with a gun. Ma'am, yes. Do not go outside. I won't.
More calls were coming into the 911 dispatch center that there was a man with a gun firing shots.
It looked like he had a rifle with him.
There's a park right there, and somebody had seen this guy walk through the park.
John, she said this lady just saw him run through that park.
And it's 6 o'clock on a Friday, I believe. So the place should be just packed full of kids, but for some reason it wasn't that day, which is probably a good thing.
Officer Stearns and fellow officer Kyle Stoy converged on the small neighborhood park, but did not see the armed suspect. They hurried along a neighborhood street, checking backyards and surrounding areas.
And we started hearing some shots.
Be advised that one of the residents advised that he did hear one shot earlier.
The first shots that we heard were only just a backyard or two away, and it was a high caliber rifle, and we could tell that this was a very real deal, and that it wasn't a joke. So,
unknown to the officers at the time, the suspect had entered the backyard of an Edmond resident. On this warm evening, the homeowner was sanding a door and had no chance of escape as the gunman shot and killed him.
I hear gunshots.
Only a few homes away, Officer Stearns and Officer Stoy raced towards the sound of the gunfire.
Moving from house to house, from backyard to backyard, jumping fences at a heightened sense of awareness is pretty physically taxing. I mean, it's physically taxing just to do that without being somewhat in the middle of a gunfight. But moving with equipment that you don't usually move with, moving in an area that you don't usually move in, and in an environment that is pretty hostile at that point, was pretty physically demanding. But it's one of those things where you don't really have a choice. You just got to do what you got to do and get done what you need to get done.
Other police officers began to arrive in the neighborhood as the gunman continued to wander through yards, sometimes disappearing into the backyards of innocent civilians.
The other officers at the scene had said that he was running northbound, which we were on the north side of this guy, and like a street over. And I remember thinking, he's coming right at us. We're in the same spot he is, just directly north. He's running north at us.
The armed suspect entered another backyard where he fired upon a second victim, wounding him.
They sounded like they were coming right at us, and so we kind of hunkered down, got into a position to where we could defend ourselves and waited for him to come out. He never did.
Instead, the gunman turned back and walked through the front yard of the wounded civilian's home. The man spotted a woman and her son who came outside to see what was going on. The gunman raised his rifle and tried to shoot towards the woman and boy, but his gun misfired and jammed. From about 75 yards away, Officer John Ziegler spotted the suspect and fired his pistol, hitting him in the leg. Unable to move freely now, the gunman dragged himself behind a bush and tried to clear his disabled rifle. At this point, Officer Stearns and Officer Stoy had converged on the area around the downed suspect.
We're yelling commands at him. There's another resident across the street that heard all the commotion, was coming out to see what was going on. He actually got up on his roof and was yelling kind of a play-by-play of what was going on. We're yelling at this guy to go back inside. We're yelling at the suspect to drop his rifle. He's not complying. We did have a few cars that were driving down the street. We were trying to coordinate, people, other officers approaching to block off the roads, but we've got people driving up and down, and we're yelling for them to stop, and they're kind of stopping right in front of the suspect, just a few yards, and then we're telling them to go, and they're not really sure what to do, and we're trying to worry about the guy with the rifle. So there's a lot going on. It was very dynamic, I guess. And
though immobile, the suspect was still able to handle his rifle as he tried to reload it. The fear of the gunman shooting a fellow police officer or an innocent bystander was on the mind of Officer Stearns.
At any point, he could level a gun at any direction and shoot any of us. I know at that point, his intentions are not good. He's got a weapon capable of penetrating any type of body armor or any kind of equipment that we have. We know at that point that he has shot multiple rounds in the open air in a neighborhood. So I was in fear for my life, in fear for the lives of the other guys that were out there, in fear for the civilians, in fear for people that were just sitting in their houses. Maybe didn't even know what was going on, because any one of those rounds could penetrate a brick wall and kill somebody inside. So there were a lot of fears.
Hunkered down behind the bush, the suspect ignored the commands of police officers and continued to reload his rifle.
And before he was able to fire any more rounds, myself and Officer Stoy both fired on the subject, hitting and killing him at that time. There was no option. There was no other option of what we could do. That was the last line of defense.
After an officer is involved in a shooting, this is sometimes one of the most stressful events that an officer can undergo. One, he's under great stress. Usually there are feelings of doubts, uncertainty. You're always questioning yourself, did you do the right thing, even though it may be completely appropriate under the circumstances. But because of the nature of how we conduct these investigations, it puts additional strain on the officer.
When an officer is involved in an on-duty shooting, he is the subject of both a criminal investigation and an internal investigation. First, a report is prepared for a potential criminal investigation against the officer. The report is given to the district attorney, and the officer is also placed on administrative leave. The district attorney examines the report and determines if the force was reasonable under the circumstances. Also, an internal investigation over the shooting is conducted. Officer statements are obtained and firearms are closely examined.
And the internal investigation was a challenge for me, because here I am, a police officer. I'm the one that has been reading rights to people, and then I'm laying in my hospital bed and they come up there and they clear my room out and then they Mirandize me. And I'm saying, what? I didn't do anything wrong. And so that was a big challenge, the internal investigation part of it.
It is a tremendous burden that an officer has to undergo, even though in most cases, and in the cases of Edmond that we've had, we've never had a case of improper use of deadly force. It still is a tremendous burden on the officer.
Protecting the lives of the public has been something Officer Dixon has wanted to do for a very long time.
Ever since I was 5 years old.
After his incident in November of 1990, Officer Dixon did not return to duty until February of 1991. Even then, he was only assigned light duty. The bullet that entered his lower left leg that unforgettable night tore through his Achilles tendon, resulting in a loss of flexibility in his foot, leg, and ankle area. Because of this, Gerald would have to go through intense physical therapy before he could return to patrolling Edmond streets.
Even to this day, there's some noticeable effects of it even to this day.
Officer Dixon's major obstacle, though, wasn't dealing with the physical pain to his gunshot wound or the therapy afterwards.
My big issue coming back was being able to go to the crime scene. And I had to have a few of my close friends here at the police department go with me. That was my biggest challenge, to go back to that and see it all over again.
I know from personal experience that that event will be with him for the rest of his life. Oftentimes those are life-changing events. I've seen officers that literally go through a depression cycle that lasts for years. I've seen other officers that bounce back immediately. What I do know is that it is something that none of them ever want to occur. Most, an overwhelming majority of people have never fired their weapons. I've drawn my weapon many times, but I've never actually fired my weapon in making an arrest or being under an assault. And that's true for almost most police officers as well. So they are well trained. They know how to take the necessary steps if they have to use deadly force. Most do not want that to occur. We never want them to believe, though, that it is not something that is optional. It is not something that you should resist if the facts and the circumstances call for it, because you not only can get yourself killed, but you can get members of the public also killed if you don't take the necessary step. Just as if Officer Jason Stearns had been reluctant to use deadly force on the particular day that he did, more than likely we could have had other people killed in the Edmond community.
Officer Jason Stearns and 4 other officers who were involved in the incident in 2001 returned to duty on the 4th of July, almost 2 weeks after the neighborhood shooting.
It might not have been the best day to come back due to all the fireworks going on. I remember hearing fireworks, which sounded like gunshots to me all day long the day I came back to work. So that might have not been the best idea.
To help him face the aftermath of his incident, Officer Stearns relied on other officers who had been involved in similar situations.
I had talked to another sergeant at the time who had been through another shooting, and talked to him and said, hey, this is what's going on with me. And he said, man, I've had that same thing happen to me, or this is what happened to me. And so I was able to talk to somebody who had been through it and done that. It's hard to get a good, accurate picture or know exactly what another officer's going through if you haven't been through it yourself. So, you know, it was nice to be able to talk to somebody.
To talk with someone, to know that they have been there, that they've been able to get through the process and come out okay, is also a big benefit to any officer that's involved in a high traumatic situation. And again, the use of deadly force is probably the most traumatic incident that we undergo.
A lot of it, I think, is mental preparation, you know, preparing yourself, preparing your family for something like that.
The key to preparing for the various types of situations an Edmond officer can encounter is ongoing and specialized officer training.
We have found that when we undergo stressful events, we always revert back to our basic training. Because of that, in Edmond, the Edmond way, we believe, is to train our officers repeatedly, much beyond the minimum standards, so that when any event presents itself, we will have the proper training regardless of what the tool is within the officer's toolkit, be it pepper spray, be it a taser, be it a firearm. All of these require specialized training as to when they should be used and how they should be used.
I take defensive tactics very serious, even to this day, because you work the way you train. If you train hard, you work hard. And that's the attitude that I take.
I realized how important the tools were that we used. Well, I'd always heard that, coming up through the ranks, and it's an important tool, and yeah, I can shoot enough to qualify, which is great, but is that enough? So after that, I realized just how important they are. Went through firearms instructor school and became more than proficient with any firearm that I carry.
Today, both Officer Stearns and Officer Dixon tell their story to new recruits training to be Edmond police officers, hoping to pass on advice that could help future officers if and when they face similar situations.
My advice to new officers is to take your training serious, get as much range time as you can, get as much as physical training, stay in shape. That's the main thing. Stay in good physical shape, because if you're more physically in shape, it also helps your mental ability as well in those challenging situations, because it takes it all. And then get the training, good training, and we offer that here at the Edmond Police Department.
The life of a police officer is not necessarily an easy one. We often see the debris of human life that others have discarded. Just this week, I believe we've had 3 people die of overdoses, one with a hypodermic needle stuck in her arm. We've had other overdoses that have occurred this week. These are people who are going through life's challenges and are just not able to cope. We are there to clean that up. We're there when people are having fights, they're hitting each other with beer bottles, stabbing each other. We're the ones that have to separate them, try to make sense out of all this. We have the babies that we've had in the last couple of years, 2 babies that have been killed, that have been beaten viciously by their so-called parents that are supposed to be there to protect them. And we have to go in and clean up that mess. The public doesn't see it. They see the sanitized version that's on the news. Okay, somebody got killed, a child was brutalized or died as a result of injuries. They don't see the blood, they don't see the brutality that's involved. Our officers experience it firsthand. They're the first ones there, they're the ones that have to clean it up. One of the most difficult things that an officer has to do is to notify a family member that a loved one has died. I can remember when a highway patrol trooper was killed and I had to notify the widow. Probably the most difficult thing I have had to do. And an officer has to do that on a regular basis. We're constantly notifying loved ones that their loved one has passed away, has been the subject of violence, or perhaps subject of an overdose. It's an unfortunate circumstance, but that's the calling that we have been given. What we have to be careful, because of the things that we see, the cruelty that's exhibited by people against each other, is that it does not harden our hearts. We are there with a calling to be servant leaders. And we also have to be very careful that what we see, what we observe, does not carry back home to our own families, that it does not affect our own attitudes toward our job, that it does not make us so callous that we don't reach out and help others and remember the reasons why we've been called to this job.
People look at Edmond as that nothing bad happens in Edmond. I'm telling you, crime happens in Edmond. Most of it's property crime, but some of the other crimes, the personal crimes, if you will, do happen in Edmond. And we have to deal with those on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't always make the news, but we deal with them on a day-to-day basis. And we have to be aware of those things. And when I make traffic stops, I make the traffic stop being aware of what's going on, and at the same time, treating that person with dignity and respect, because that's what we should do, is work on being courteous to the public until they dictate that they want to be treated otherwise. And then we handle it as quickly and as appropriately as possible.
Edmond is one of the safest communities in the United States, but unfortunately it does not mean that we're immune from potential threats that have occurred here. The cases of Officer Stearns and Officer Dixon demonstrated that on occasion we've even had to use lethal force here in Edmond. The post office shootings that we've had, and the other situations where our officers had been in life and death struggles. We oftentimes present ourselves as a very, very safe community, almost immune from violence, but to the officer, he has to work extremely hard and sees that is not necessarily the case. But he works very hard, very diligent to keep this the safest community that we have in Oklahoma, and it is the #1 safest community in Oklahoma for violent crimes. We intend to keep it that way, but one reason is because of the great training that we have, the preparation that the officers have, and the attention to detail that they undergo to keep this the safest community in Oklahoma. What is the Edmond Way? Edmond Way is that we are not trying to do what is average. We are striving for excellence, and we believe that in everything that we do, be it from the hiring of the best, the most intelligent, the most capable people, the people with the most common sense, who are servant leaders, who want to be there because they're willing to take risks, but they're not thrill seekers, who are people who are dedicated to serving their community, the people who have the best interests of their community at heart, who are willing to work hard to make this a better community, and that are willing to make the sacrifices necessary in order to be not a good police officer, but to be an outstanding police officer.
This video series was produced by the Edmond Police Department and the Cops Leadership Council. To learn more about the Leadership Council and its partnership with the Edmond Police Department, please visit edmondpd.com or call 359-4440. You can watch past episodes of The Edmond Way on YouTube. Just search City of Edmond, OK.